with cosmology in Carly Sullivan's drawings of the moons of the solar system. And she started doing these as aids to memory because she was trying to memorize the 160 moons and decided that a way of fixing them in her memory was to start doing drawings from NASA photographs of the moons themselves. And when there weren't adequate photographs, she created imaginative equivalents. And these then, because of the combination of memory, imagination, and observation, these serve as shorthand for some of the larger questions of how cosmology interacts with mental limits, which in terms of actual cosmology, the issue is the trustworthiness of mathematics. Can we believe the math when it comes to things we can never test empirically, such as the theory of multiple universes? Because the numeric function of mind corresponds to so much of physical reality, does the remainder of what we call reality correspond to the numeric functions the mind has imagined? It's a debate in physics that many of us can scarcely get our heads around who are not physicists. But there are many things we can't get our heads around, and many of them affect how we live our lives more directly than cosmology ever will. Write German's intricately labeled heart with no interpretive key. On the right-hand side, the topmost row, the metaphor for all the questions of emotion and daily living and how we relate to it, that it requires considerable cultural analysis to express adequately, and I could go on for probably half an hour trying to explicate what's going on in all these things. I'll just point out on the bottom row that we have cliffs of fall, not unlike the mines, mountains we find in Julie Sims' diorama across the way. And also the male anxiety at female sexuality of the woman, the seductive woman holding the signage, Nature's Terrifying Death Trap, which is deliberately put next to the piece Man Improves on Nature, because culture has come up with enough death traps of its own, far beyond anything that nature has ever been able to provide. And the one in which Michelangelo's Moses is replaced by a cosmic geometry with the heading Evolution of Extraterrestrials opens us out into the imaginative dimensions, once again, of the speculation beyond the empirical. But empirical complex systems are hard enough for outsiders to understand. It's just why the Center for Chemical Evolution at Georgia Tech and elsewhere commissioned Terri Dilling as artist in residence to produce visual metaphors for the general public of how simple chemical interactions could give rise to complex molecules, which in turn could give rise to living systems. But the prints also illustrate how vast complexities arise out of simple variables in general. And I will say at this point that her video in the next gallery further illustrates this with the two paintings on the wall in there, both of which spring from an identical initial gesture and then move in dramatically different directions of evolution. And I might mention here Raquel Rosalind and Raphael Marchetti's Machine of the Garden, which is flooded at the moment. Also, on the other side of the house, also deals with a complex system that arises out of simple variables and takes on some of the self-regulating aspects of a living system, including, unfortunately, mortality. It's had to be brought back from the brink several times. And this time, they really have gone over it. get back to the room we're in, the simple variables in society regrettably can include such things as the unconscious racial attitudes encoded in Bethany Collins' erased repetitions in the painting on the wall behind you of the question, do people ever think you're white? The question, an embarrassing question under erasure that eventually decomposes into that galaxy of unexpressed questions that is simply the loose letters of the question itself scattered in intriguing but unintelligible patterns. And again, I would say that Hugo Cortez's video over at the Whitespace project space also addresses these questions, starting from the strange consequences of the belief that England will fall if the Ravens ever leave the Tower of London. So their wings are clipped to keep them around. Similar collisions of the rational and the irrational occur on Tierra del Fuego in the second and third parts of Cortez's video, where the inhabitants that Charles Darwin saw, who were labeled savages, were done in by the same civilization that now threatens the wildlife of the place. And I insert that here both because it relates in terms of cultural complex systems and the barriers to understanding them, and because I really didn't want to have to make everyone traipse over to Whitespace, where the afterwards, please, yes, try it, but not now. So, as I point is that the systems of nature and culture interact with one another in intricate ways, and we seldom can keep all of them in mind at the same moment. And Stewart's, make sure I got the title right, Assumptions and Propositions, is illustrative of the precision of the entanglement. It's an incredibly complex geometry that is very difficult. You can't really keep it all in mind looking at it as a whole, and if you try to look at the details, you've forgotten what it was you saw on the other side of the drawings. So even though there's precision, there's the impossibility of, simply by virtue of our mental limits, of comprehending it all at once, which means that in practice, trying to deal with nature and culture all at the same time, we end up with something more like the Baroque imaginative interplay of the painting next to it, Julianne Treu's literally titled Photodisintegration, which the middle images are frequently as elusive as these impossible visual combinations, all of which resemble things that we sort of remember from biology textbooks and natural history images and microscope slides, but when we try to actually isolate any of them, they are none of the above, and they're never found in those combinations, even if they were representative of them. So, in addition to that obstacle, the mind itself throws up its own physical obstacles to getting the mental pictures right. Our capacity for logic and our emotional responses to the world in general depend on the condition of parts of the brain that can be represented metaphorically as volcanic terrain, or as the cliffs of fall, of which Gerard Manley Hopkins wrote in the poem that asserts, oh, the mind has mountains. So Julie Sims' diorama photographed there, eruptive fissure, hippocampal subfields, opens up a further complication in our quest to understand complex systems and the world's interconnections. And at this point, see, this is moving even faster than I had intended because I figured people, as I said, people can't stand around for 45 minutes. So now we're actually ready for the next gallery, which I will say while we're trying to move that I burst out laughing when I read my next sentence recently because the next gallery presents images that relate to the complex system of water, necessary for the maintenance of life, occurring in a cycle from evaporation to rainfall and storage as groundwater in geological aquifers, existing in forms from glacial ice to the saltwater of the world's ocean. Water has also been a mythic metaphor from which imaginations have spun potent stories. Some of those stories are referenced in Sissy Fonseca's performance art, which is documented in Whitespace along with Forte's video. And now we can actually move and look at the work. If you see, I think I can not only stand but even walk around a little in here. But because as I said in there, trying to explain why the complex system of water was chosen, although frankly another reason is that we knew that one of the visiting Brazilian artists was really interested in the topic of water, so it seemed like a courteous thing as well as a very appropriate thing. But because once that decision had been made, all of these wonderful combinations emerged from that decision. Because the room begins with Seana Reilly's epistemic darkness, which is the assertion of all the things we can never know, which is symbolized at the bottom of this marvelous liquid graphite work by the equations of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Her other two pieces, however, relate directly to fluid dynamics and that involved in tsunamis in one, and to hydrofracking in the piece with Fisher. Of course, the impact on groundwater of using water to shatter shale to release natural gas is still under debate when the issue is acknowledged at all. So this is another one of those places where nature and culture collide in interesting ways that people seem to have difficulty really keeping all in mind at the same time. Todd Murphy's iceberg photo in Narrow Road to the Far South, number 23 of the series, references the heroic scale of romantic seascape paintings, but icebergs in general can be metaphors for looming catastrophe, as well as literal reminders of the increasingly rapid degradation of the Antarctic ice shelf. And the potential consequences of that for sea levels are dire. So once again, culture, nature, imagination, and science coincide in this very resonant image. But the thought of natural catastrophe leads naturally to Marcia Vaitsman, trying to get it more or less right, image of the Japanese tsunami, a panorama created from successive television representations of the great wave making its way to land. That representation of nature through visual media leads to the topic very rapidly, because we're running out of wall space, of how our perception of complex systems is being altered at this very moment by our technology. Thus, I asked Henry Detweiler to modify one of his earlier works to present QR codes that lead, for those of us with smartphones, to the web pages from which Carly Sullivan began the show with her drawings. This fulfills the promise of the title of Coming Back Again to Cosmology. But as this circularity suggests, we are caught in a feedback loop of interpretation in which we are part of the system we are trying to interpret. So the story is trying to tell the story that includes itself, as Beth Lilly's photograph of her, once again, aid to memory, reminds us. For all of that, we have no choice but to continue to dare to know, as Harris Dimitropoulos' representation of the sound of those spoken words, or rather of the Latin for them, aude sapere, tells us. Here, the injunction to dare to know, which is on that wall, that on the other side of the wall that a good many of you are standing on this side of, is hidden behind an ancient barrier and a contemporary one. And in this case, yet another barrier. Few people these days know Latin, and no one can readily read this technologically mediated representation of the words. Much the same problem arises in Dick Robinson's sound piece, which is not playing at the moment because it conflicts with the video, in which portentous utterances almost never quite manage to arrive through the enveloping screen of electronic noise. We tend to hear at most the mind and what I have to say. And Chelsea Rathro's videos in the side room alongside Terri Dilling's further represent the consequences of complex systems. That leaves, again on that side of the wall, the mythic mashup of Nicky Starrs' Unishark, which at my suggestion has been further encased in a conceptual vitrine suggestive of Damien Hirst's famous shark in formaldehyde. The Unishark is a collision of two opposing pop culture archetypes, unicorn and shark, but also it's a witty reference to the fact that the myth of the unicorn in the Middle Ages arose to interpret the meaning of narwhal tusks, which come from the sea but do not come from sharks any more than they come from horned horses. So the Unishark is yet another newly created myth of the world's waters. And I would mention that the ultimate collision of nature and culture takes place at the entryway to the gallery, where Kelly O'Brien's not quite painting, not quite sculpture embraces a tree with dramatic lighting after dark when the weather is less inclement than it is tonight. That commentary on our expectations as to what artworks should be, which is yet another complex system, illustrates the fact that I've said relatively little about the art itself compared to the ideas behind the show. This is because I think that topic is best addressed in questions to me or to the artists who happen to be here, whom, if I start going around the room, I will miss people. Why don't you hold up your hand and utter your names? Seana, you might start. And Julie Sims actually is here, who's filming, so she, and Terri, Marcia, and Terri. Anybody else? Because I may have missed somebody in the crowd.
Terri.
Mm-hmm. Okay, like I say, on the other side of the wall. Okay. All right. Anyway, and you'll notice so I hope you will not feel there is false advertising, that I haven't said anything about how neurology or the emerging discipline of neuroaesthetics might help us understand complex systems and our difficulty in comprehending complex systems' full dimensions. This is because that would be a second level of interpretation that goes far beyond what you find on the walls and forward environment of Whitespace. I have addressed some of those topics in my comments on the Whitespace blog, and I would recommend a recently published book that I have a review of in Burnaway of The Age of Insight, which was by Eric Handel, which combines an analysis of Vienna 1900 and the era of Freud and the unconscious with the most recent findings in neurology and how they might relate to understanding our relationship to artworks. And that's it. At least that's all I have to say. I wish Harris was here because I have never gotten an adequate explanation what is going on in that piece, so I'm embarrassed.
We think so.
We think so, yeah.
We definitely think so. He is here.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, no, it's just.
Yes. In the back, yes. Roll, yeah. Yes.
Okay. I was just wondering, did you select the people to be in the show after you got your concept together for it?
Yes, definitely.
And before they had done the artworks?
No, most of these have been in other exhibitions. I asked Henry Detweiler to adapt his from the pieces that were in Mint Gallery. I asked Nikki Stars to adapt hers. Seana Reilly produced this piece specifically for the exhibition. Let's see, and
Carly.
Carly Sullivan's actually, Seana made me aware of the pieces. They have not been previously exhibited, though they were not made specifically for the show. And let's see. Is there anything else that was, I think that's it in terms of things that were actually commissioned.
Well,
Terri, what's the name of that book again you mentioned?
The Age of Insight, which it has one of those impossibly long subtitles about the quest for understanding of the unconscious from the 1900 to the present day or something. It has even more words in it than that. If you go to burnaway.org, there's a review of that and one of the books that I mentioned on the Whitespace blog, Survival of the Beautiful, that just went up this afternoon, so it should still be on the Burnaway homepage. The author is one of the Nobel laureates. Actually, he was in neurology, so he knows whereof he speaks. By virtue of having been born in Vienna, he knows whereof he speaks about the aesthetics and culture of 20th century Vienna and his own discipline. Yeah.
Terri, you said on your blog that a lot of this comes out of your dissertation that you are working on. But the concept of putting together an exhibition, was that rather recent, or is it something you've been walking around? Okay.
No, in fact, really the concept of the exhibition is a direct result of Barbara Maria Stafford's Neurohumanities Entanglement Conference in March at Georgia Tech, which led to my buying the anthology that I would recommend highly about trying to relate brain science and neurology to and cognitive science to the humanities, and starting a conversation among the various disciplines. That it is called, one of those less than helpful titles, A Field Guide to a New Meta Field.
What? Say that again?
A Field Guide to a New Meta Field. But actually, I do mention that one in my blog post called, I do mention that one in my blog post called Reading List. We don't need no stinking reading list. Which was actually an allusion to the fact that, of course, there have been a ludicrous number of books about art and neuroaesthetics and that's of varying degrees of value. When Jonah Lehrer's book Imagine, The Secret of Creativity, was recalled because he made up some of the quotes in it, I went to look at it and discovered to my great relief it is a horribly bad book. You will learn almost nothing about the topics of this exhibition from that. And the irony is that he would have gotten along perfectly well if he hadn't made up the quotes from Bob Dylan to buttress his argument about Dylan's song. So, but anyway, as I say, seriously, Barbara Maria Stafford's anthology, A Field Guide to a New Meta Field, and Eric Kandel's The Age of Insight, all of that long subtitle, I would recommend as if you're going to read any two books, those are the two I would suggest you look at. Yeah.
So when you talk about complexity and complex systems, it seems religion was not one of the points, besides of some kind of
Well,
reference that Cece made. How am I wrong, or how do you see that?
you're not wrong. I decided that, and I'm pleased that the Neurohumanities Entanglement Conference actually began with the question of religion and with a hardcore, an Emory University professor who has done a rather hardcore dissection of religion under the subtitle, Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not, which is all about the idea that we are hardwired in some ways to be religious, and the difficulty is learning how to be analytical and critical. But then Barbara Stafford had two neurologically inclined members of the university, women from the University of Chicago Divinity School, as the next speakers, presenting an implicitly contrary viewpoint regarding the value of religion and why it was an intrinsic part of human existence that should not be discarded because it is, whether it fits with our mental wiring or not. And there was, but in the case of this show, if you look closely at Mike German's pieces, in some ways they're all about the religious question, but I chose consciously to bracket religion in this show because I had the feeling, given recent history, that if I started talking about what the show had to do with religion, that would be all anybody would ever talk about. So it is referred to, but I have just very, very consciously chosen not to bring it up. It's where, in many ways, it's where I started back in my Jungian days as a college senior, writing my paper on literary criticism of consciousness for that senior seminar, and then doing my history of religions MA thesis critiquing Joseph Campbell's The Masks of God, and going on from there in my doctorate to many different questions that ended up on or more accurately jumped after 3 chapters on American poets to a grandiose theory of human existence based on what I'd done so far. It was pointed out by my committee that there was something of a shock between chapters 3 and 4, but they were inclined just to get me out of there. So I'm sure it's one of the many reasons the dissertation has never been published, but you can find it on the shelves at Emory and probably from University Microfilm still if you Google my name and the Edenic Imagination. But, okay. So do you want to talk about, well, yeah, I feel like the artists should be talking about what their pieces are actually about as to how they have been, as distinct from how they have been fitted into this show, although I feel I haven't hopelessly distorted them. There's a whole lot more in all of them than I've referred to in this gallery talk. You don't have to, but, well, I mean, why don't you, why don't you just talk about that series and how it came into being?
Yeah, so it is a photograph from the tsunami, but it's a photograph that is the result of a video movement. So what you see is actually 3 minutes condensed in one frame. So the element that I would bring to our talk now would be the media and the perception through the media, which I think this piece is very strong, talking about the way we perceive things that are not around us through the screen. So the tsunami was actually built through the imaginarium of YouTube. Even CNN was using what those guys recorded with their domestic cameras or cell phones. So I decided to go through the TV to YouTube and acquire this 3 minutes of what we will remember in 10 years or 20 years of what the tsunami was.
How did you actually capture these?
It's very low tech. It's the screen and the hand scanner. So,
So you just sat and did this?
yeah.
But while
While it's being played, so that's why you see artifacts, like digital artifacts, and you see also like breaks, and there is not a real coherence there, although lots of people see water, and I also see water there.
so it's a total composite. It's not. This is not at all what it looked like.
This is exactly what the scan looks like, but not what the video looks like, because the movement and time is missing.
Well, I can tell you that the liquid graphite works are dealing specifically with how we relate to nature and what we can know about it. And we seem to be, we're categorical thinkers. When we look at something, we organize it in our brains, we put formulas with it, and we manipulate things intellectually. And a lot of this work is just about letting the physical thing happen. So the liquid graphite, I don't really touch it. I just go in and tip it around and let it flow the way it goes the way it's going to go. And then I stop when it's done and I'll look at it and say, oh, this reminds me of something that has to do with fluid dynamics, the way the earth moves, or something. The one on the right was obviously the hydrofracking piece. It reminded me of the imagery I'd seen with that. And then I go back and I research all the engineering that goes into these sorts of things, and those get superimposed on top, the way we superimpose these systems, ways of thinking, on top of nature. Yeah, and on the one on the left hand, underneath of all that, I don't know if I ever told Jerry this, but underneath of it are all these old drawings from old drawings from Descartes and old Newton's, all the formulas had to do with that, old ways of thinking. It's covered with drawings underneath of that, and then the black went down, and I wasn't sure how much the black was going to cover up, and it covered up all of it. So it's under there, though. Yeah. And then all the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is basically you can only know either where something is or how fast it's going. You can't know both at the same time. So if you know one thing, you cannot know the other. So this is about the things that we don't know, we can't know. And a lot of this has to do also with, I used to do a lot of meditating, and I got to a point where I could experience the physical without putting any sort of judgment on it, any sort of emotional. It's like you feel pain and you pull away from it. Well, it just became a sensation. I got to the point where I could separate the judgment I was making from the actual thing, and that's where all this kind of started, me thinking about that.
As I said, I'm not forcing anybody to make any comments, but so thank you. That really helped. Sorry?
Beth Lilly.
Yes, that's why knowing the series this comes from, I didn't want to force you to say anything about it, but if you would like to, I would be delighted.
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about that piece. The series that Jerry is referencing is called Dream of the Red Elephant, and I retell and reenact true stories from my life, and they're all about perception and the subjectivity of perception. And in this particular case, I chose stories that mental illness, particularly schizophrenia, runs in my family, and my mother was untreated schizophrenic, and so it really gave me an interesting idea about the meaning of reality, and I always stood it as something to be very fluid. This is the final piece, and it's kind of talking about the obsession you have about still trying to make sense of things by telling yourself stories. And the story is your life, and the story keeps going, and you can never finish it because da 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 da. And this is an actual piece of paper. I had an experience where, some might say an awakening, and this idea came to me, and I just grabbed whatever I had, which was a crayon and a piece of paper, and wrote down that thought. And I thought it kind of summed up that whole process, that loop, and the inevitability, but still feeling compelled to try nevertheless.
So it's what I just said. Terri, do you want to say something about your residency and doing?
Sure. The residency was an award for me to sort of work with these different scientists. There are a large affiliation of scientists with the Center for Chemical Evolution, and learn about their research and choose some areas that interested me to make artwork in response. And their interest is having an artist create work that starts a dialogue and gets people to learn a little bit about what chemical evolution is. And I think Jerry summarized some of these prints very well, that I was just trying to get a broader overview of like what is chemical evolution. A lot of people probably never heard it before, and so what they are studying really is how those simple elements, how did life start, how did simple elements come together to form life, and how there were lots of different combinations on the early Earth, and we had lots of elements. So I was using printmaking as a metaphor where you can print plates, you can rotate them and layer them in different ways to make these different combinations and kind of see what would happen visually, and that sort of was a metaphor maybe for what the scientists are doing. And just briefly, the two paintings I did, the video that's in there, came from a conversation with one of the scientists in particular who's studying all these genetic sequences, and he's looking back for common ancestors. So we have all these complex life forms now, and he's trying to project backwards in time to like what the simple common genetic thing might have been. And so I was interested in the process of painting and how you start with a simple thing, or you start with the same point, but things evolve very differently. And then through the animation, because it plays forward and back as you see the painting evolve, you see sort of the starting point of where we are with complex systems today, maybe sort of projecting back to what that simple point is.
Did you do video last year at Emory related to this?
Mm-mm. No, this
Somebody
is
from
my
the-
first one.
Okay, somebody from that center did.
Terri, does he have a theory on what that is? Is he gone so
No, but they've actually used computers. It's kind of just new computers to sort of generate what they think were ancestral codes of like things that aren't, and these aren't really living forms. We're talking like proteins. We're talking really, really simple things. And they've been able to create that genetic code and inject it into a protein and let it start replicating. So
It sounds fascinating.
the Center for Chemical Evolution is based at Emory and Georgia Tech, and it's an affiliation of scientists around the country that share information. It's funded by NASA and the National Science Foundation, so I think it's sort of a, sharing some of their research and data and just connecting ideas. So, yeah. So the residency is sort of their educational component of it.
Yeah. So, kind of one of the overlying themes in most of my work is about construction of reality and the way we sort of create our own reality out of our perception, and it's not necessarily always something that matches from person to person. And a lot of it depends on sort of our how maybe perceives that situation. And this series particularly deals with mental health and sort of, people's struggles with that. It's an issue that I think is important to talk about because I think it's a lot more kind of commonplace than what we like to admit, and I think there's a lot more kind of mind-body integration than how we generally perceive it in Western medicine. We like to separate, like, there's mental health and there's physical health, and I don't necessarily think that that's true at all. I just think that's the way that it's sort of been encoded in science. So this series, I'm using the idea of a landscape to refer to interiority, the physical interiority, and sort of pursuing the idea that your internal landscape can have natural disasters in the same way that an external landscape can have. And part of my idea there is that I want people to kind of maybe absorb the idea that when these things happen to you, and statistics say 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 people will experience some sort of mental health issues or crisis in their lifetime. So it's either going to be you or it'll be somebody that you love or someone that you're friends with. And so my sort of idea here was to kind of stress the part where it's not your fault. There's a lot of, especially in America, idea of like bootstraps and, you know, if you pray harder, or if you think positive, or, you know, you just suck it up and put on your smile and go about your business. And, you know, if you just change the way you think about these things, everything's going to be better. And nobody ever tells, you know, diabetics like, oh, just think positive and your diabetes is going to go away. Or, you know, any other physical illness. No one ever puts that onus on the ill person to fix yourself. And so that's kind of the idea that I'm really pursuing here, is just sort of reframing it. And that was why I went for the natural disaster, because, you know, when people experience a natural disaster like a tsunami or an earthquake or whatever, you know, you don't blame that person and say, well, you should have prevented the earth from cracking open and falling down a hole. And to me, it's kind of the same thing. So that's what this work is about for me.
The other pieces in the series resemble this?
Yeah, it's kind of the similar idea of, you know, different landscapes, but the whole series is sort of looking at that idea. And when I did it, I did a lot of research into neuroscience and, you know, kind of locating the different sites in the mind that cause these, and, you know, thinking about the different processes that break down in the mind and trying to relate those processes to a process that breaks down in the natural world.
Let's see, Jerry trying to come back.
So Jerry?